This is an ABC podcast.
Hello, Damien Carrick with you. Welcome to The Law Report. As LGBTQI Australians celebrate Pride Month this June, in many countries, progress towards legal equality has stalled or even gone into reverse.
There's a sense that when we talk about universal human rights, in some nations that's interpreted as Western human rights, and you're trying to impose your Western values on us. So increased respect for LGBTQI people in the West is being met with increased persecution in other countries.
First, vaccine passports. As the number of Australians who are fully vaccinated against COVID-19 rises, is it time to consider introducing a QR code-based digital vaccine passport? University of Sydney Professor Cameron Stewart is an expert in health law. He says internationally it's been a huge week for vaccine passports. As Israel began dismantling its domestic system, the UK announced it was putting its plans to create one on hold. Meanwhile, New York's Excelsior Pass has just hit the 1 million mark. And, perhaps most significantly, 7 EU countries went live with a passport promoting inter-country travel.
So their digital passport system will apply to all 27 of their member states by the 1st of July. It's called the Digital Green Certificate, and it basically just relates to COVID-19, so it's a specific COVID-19 passport, and it basically indicates that you're tested negative within the last 72 hours or you've had the vaccine.
So that allows you then to enter into a country without first going into quarantine?
That's right, and it also enables you not to have to be tested.
That's about travelling internationally. Israel, which was the world leader when it came to vaccine passports, is in the process of dismantling what was known as a Green Pass, and that was for domestic use. How did that work?
That was a similar system based on app technology, but it was basically abandoned because the vaccination rates now are so high in Israel that it's basically considered to be unnecessary. So the cost-benefit analysis tipped in favour of it being too costly in terms of privacy and infrastructure. So they don't need to do it basically because they've got such high vaccination rates.
They've reached the herd immunity. Has it been considered a success? What was it an important ingredient in allowing the economy to open up as the numbers of vaccinated people increased?
I think it took a lot of pressure off the question of whether things should be opened or not. So from that perspective, it probably contributed to, firstly, the desire to get vaccinated. So it was a pull factor, I think, it's fair to say. I think it also was good for businesses and also restored confidence. So even though it's now been deemed unnecessary to continue with, I think it did contribute to their successful vaccination rates.
Interestingly, though, it wasn't threatening to reduce access for those without a pass because it was introduced in a system where everybody was in heavy lockdown. So it was a path to freedom.
That's right.
Now, it appears that plans for the rollout of an Israeli-type domestic vaccine passport system in the UK have just in the last week or so been shelved. Do we know why?
The official views that we're getting from the British government is again along the lines that, well, our rates are climbing, it's probably not necessary, it could be an imposition on privacy and other matters, and if we get our vaccination rates very high, it's not something that we need to do.
One of the arguments was also that the platform that would be used there would be that the National Health Service, the NHS app, which couldn't be used by foreign visitors. So it wouldn't be something which could be used, say, in large tourist centres or hubs where there are a lot of foreign nationals gathering.
That's quite a severe limitation.
Also, it couldn't be used, for instance, by children because they're not eligible to get a vaccine. And I think back in April, the Equality and Human Rights Commission warned that the documents could amount to unlawful discrimination for say, people who can't get vaccinated for good reason.
And they're all reasons that could conceivably be reasons for not doing these things in Australia as well.
Now let's now move across the Atlantic. New York is the only US state which has a vaccine passport. It's called the Excelsior Pass, and it's just passed last week a milestone. It's now got over 1 million people who've signed up to it. How does it work? It's again an app-based system.
App-based technology, QR codes linked through the health system records that New York has. Perhaps an indication too of some cultural differences from what we experience in Australia, because our cities don't have that sort of status. They don't run their own health systems in the way that you would see in America. So there's a level of independence and also a level of governance that the cities have, which would enable them to do something like this. There's also a very large population of people in New York. There are 15 million people. So you can understand how having an app just for one city would actually make sense, because they're organising their own healthcare systems and also have big concerns about the movements of their population.
And given the extraordinary difference between the US states, you've got nationally a range of states, including, I think, Georgia, Alabama, Arizona and Florida. They've actually banned the use of vaccine passports because they're saying this is an affront to individual privacy and vaccine choice, whereas you've got other places, and New York's in the lead, saying, no, this is the way forward.
It's always difficult from this close distance to speculate on why we get differences across American states. But one of them might be that New York City has had a really terrible experience with COVID. They've seen COVID firsthand. They've had refrigerated trucks full of dead bodies. So they probably, as a population, are more inclined towards using these types of collective action than other states which may not have had that experience. Even though they might have had high infection rates, they may not have gone through the same sort of densely populated clusters that New York has.
According to an article in the New York Times, about 1.1 million people have signed up for Excelsior passes, but so far I think 9.1 million New Yorkers have been fully vaccinated. So it's still only a minority, but it is actually opening up all sorts of access to restaurants, bars, theatres, a whole bunch of businesses. But the New York Times is reporting that civic technology experts are warning that the passes can be gamed or forged relatively easily. And one expert, Albert Fox-Khan, Executive Director of the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, he claims that in just 11 minutes he was able to download somebody else's Excelsior pass using information that had been posted on social media and Google searches. So how watertight are these systems?
These systems are as watertight as all of the other systems that we use. All of these apps have the similar types of risks, and I'm sure they're all hackable to a degree. It's just a question of whether the public benefit and the private benefit is outweighed by those risks or not.
And that then goes to the context in which they're being introduced. So in the USA or in Europe, where they have had very, very high numbers coming down because of now high rates of vaccination, that cost-benefit balance will be in one place. In Australia, where we have lower levels of vaccination and an elimination model, we have a very different cost-benefit analysis and maybe a higher sensitivity to any kind of forgeries or failures of these systems.
Exactly. But all of those issues have to be taken into account. And I think another big issue too is our country is currently locked down. We've got no one coming in from overseas. It's having a massive effect on our economy. The only way that we could allow people back in would be with a vaccine passport. But as in the UK, those people won't have access to our healthcare system. So what kind of app technology can we use for those people, and how will the government recognise, someone coming from Slovakia's app or someone coming from Japan's app? We've got to have some sort of mechanism for cross-recognition of these types of vaccine passports.
And can we trust them? Here in Australia, if we introduced this kind of system for domestic purposes to kind of get into the restaurant, bar, theatre, nightclub, whatever, how might that work? Who holds the information about a person's vaccine status, and what platform might that kind of information go on to be a watertight vaccine digital passport?
Look, there's many options. One option would be to use the existing vaccine register that we currently have through Medicare, and people can access their vaccine register through their MyGov account, which is a sort of multi-sector government account used for the federal agencies. You can do your tax, you can have your medical, your My Health record. So at the moment, these are accessible through your computer and also through your mobile phone, but not in an app form that's quite easy to use on a mobile phone. So some work would have to be done at that level.
To transfer it into some kind of QR code.
Exactly. So some work would need to be done, but presumably there's many precedents that could be applied now. It's not a difficult technology to implement because they can copy systems that have been used elsewhere. Another alternative would be to use the state government apps, which are currently being used for QR codes and other things. And if you could get your vaccine status registered in those apps, then you can see how it would be kind of seamless that once you've signed into a place using a QR code, that your vaccine records would then sort of give you the tick that this is an area that you could go into or not.
And those apps are very much alive in places like Queensland and New South Wales, and I think are being rolled out in Victoria. And what do you think of the prospects of Australia embracing this kind of COVID vaccine passport?
I think there's very good reasons for doing it in the short term because of our low rate of take-up of the vaccine. So I think there'd be some real benefits for people who are put into areas of lockdown if they were able to go and do more shopping and if they were able to go to work because they've been vaccinated. That might help us have more targeted lockdowns as well, and I think that would be an improvement on the current system where we tend to lock down really large areas or whole states because we're concerned about outbreaks. Practically, I'm a bit pessimistic though because we haven't had a good run. At least the federal government hasn't had a great run with apps so far when we've been doing COVID. The COVID Safe app really wasn't much of a success. Having said that, and using anecdotal evidence, I think that at the state level, the app technology seems to be working pretty well. Again, it's just a question of political will, and is there enough of a benefit for us to implement it now whilst we're still trying to get our vaccine rates high enough to get that herd protection.
So maybe that New South Wales or Queensland app, QR app, which is used everywhere, that may serve as the model.
It may, and like in Israel, it might serve as a pull. So people can be, I don't know about vaccination, I don't really need to get it, there's no infections here at the moment. But when you see what's happening in Victoria at the moment and you think, well, actually, if I did have it, I could still travel and I could still do my work, then that might be enough to get people over the hesitancy and they'll go and get vaccinated. And then you can see after a period of time, with enough attraction, the vaccination rates will be high enough for us then to have the protections that we need.
University of Sydney Professor Cameron Stewart, expert in health law. Thank you for speaking to The Law Report.
Thanks, Damien.
You're listening to The Law Report on ABC Radio National with Damien Carrick. Available anywhere, anytime, via the ABC Listen app or wherever you get your podcasts.
June is Pride Month. All around Australia, there are events celebrating LGBTQI life and community. And there's a lot to celebrate. In recent years, enormous strides have been made, most notably marriage equality. But across the globe, the picture is much more mixed. In many countries, old prejudices endure, and in some cases, hostility is on the rise. Monash University Professor Paula Gerber is the editor of a series of 3 recently published books titled Worldwide Perspectives on Lesbians, Gays and Bisexuals.
It's very mixed. We have some great achievements that we need to celebrate. 15% of the world's population now lives in countries which allow same-sex couples to marry, but 23% of the world's population live in countries where it's a crime to be gay. And until recently, until September 2018, that was actually 40%. But India decriminalised, and India's population accounts for 17% of the world's population. So that brought that number down significantly. But I think of it as a pendulum. A lot of the Western democratic countries are getting increasing respect and freedom for LGBTQI people, but the global south, it's getting a lot worse in many countries.
You keep an eye on these issues. What's been happening, say, just in the last month in places across the world?
Makes my hair curl when you go through just in the last month, a 20-year-old gay activist in Iran was beheaded by members of his own family just days before he was planning to leave Iran to seek asylum in Turkey. 2 transgender women in Cameroon were jailed for 5 years for the crime of attempted homosexuality. In Ghana, 21 people were arrested at a training event for paralegals to learn how to support LGBTQI people who were getting in strife. In Tonga, a 41-year-old lady, which is their transgender community, was murdered. In Germany, we see that hate crimes have increased against LGBTIQ people by 36% in 2020.
Paula Gerber, you're a legal scholar, you're a lawyer. How important is law reform from, say, decriminalisation through to the introduction of anti-discrimination laws through to marriage equality? How important is it to focus on legal reform?
The laws that the government mandates set the tone for society. So if the law says it's okay to discriminate against people because they're gay, then society will feel like they can commit hate crimes and can persecute gay people.
It opens the door to all sorts of non-state act of violence as well as ongoing state discrimination.
That's right. But it's also important to recognise that the law is only ever one piece of the jigsaw puzzle. And South Africa is a very good example of that. They were the first country in the world to include a prohibition on discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation in their constitution. But it's still one of the most dangerous places to be a gay person because attitudes are still very homophobic and there are regular what's called curative rapes where women are raped in order to turn them straight. And there's lots of gay men being beaten and murdered on the streets. So the law alone is not going to fix the problem, but it is an important component.
One of your 3 books is focused very much on law, and you're the editor, and people from various countries have written the various chapters. And I understand that some of them say that law reform is important, decriminalisation is important, but other forms of protection or change are also very important and perhaps more important than decriminalisation. What do they mean by that? Because that sounds very counterintuitive to my ears.
Does, and it was surprising to me when I first started having these conversations. There are 71 countries in the world that still criminalise homosexuality, and I thought, well, that's got to be the priorities to get those countries to decriminalise. But when you start talking to some people who live in some of these countries, for example, Samoa still criminalises sodomy, they go, well, that's not our priority in terms of law reform because that law hasn't been enforced for years, if not decades. It doesn't impact on our day-to-day lived experience. What helps us is to have, for example, anti-discrimination laws so that we cannot be discriminated against because of our sexual orientation or gender identity in accessing healthcare, education, housing, goods and services. That would be more helpful law reform than decriminalisation.
You talk about that pendulum before. I mean, in recent years, I think it's fair to say that there has been increased official demonisation of LGBTQI people in many parts of the world. But for instance, say in Poland, Russia, Hungary, LGBTQI people are often put forward as some kind of symptom of globalisation, of imported westernisation, of the erosion of traditional family values and culture.
Yes, there's a sense that when we talk about universal human rights, in some nations that's interpreted as Western human rights, and you're trying to impose your Western values on us. So there has been resistance to increased respect for LGBTQI people in the West is being met with increased persecution in other countries. So, for example, Chad, for the first time ever in 2017, criminalised homosexual conduct. Gambia in 2014 created an entirely new offence of aggravated homosexuality, which is if you're HIV positive or you are, in quotation marks, a serial offender. So although we can see a sort of a global trend towards increased respect for LGBTQI people, there is also this counter movement that's seeing increased hatred and persecution. And perhaps more so than Poland. Poland now has 100 cities that have passed resolutions that say we are free of LGBTI ideology. Now, Poland doesn't criminalise homosexuality, yet there is this distinct movement. And when they had a Pride march recently, the marchers were beaten and attacked and assaulted by anti-gay protesters.
We're talking about a country which is a member of the EU and which is a functioning democracy.
Yes, exactly.
One region of the world we haven't spoken about is China. What is the situation there?
China's an interesting country because they decriminalised in 1997 and then they depathologized in 2001. That is, they recognised that being gay or trans is not a disease or disorder. But it is still not a very LGBTQI-friendly country. They have what they call the 3 no's policy. So there's no approval, there's no disapproval, there's no promotion. So it's almost a bit like the don't ask, don't tell policy that the US military used to have towards LGBTQI people. And what we see is they don't have pride marches in China because that is too politically sensitive. Instead, they have cultural festivals because that's not seen as threatening to the government.
Paula Gerber, how do you see a way forward through these obstacles?
Continued dialogue. You know, what we're finding in Africa, for example, is that countries that have decriminalised, like Botswana, like the Seychelles, like South Africa, they should be talking to other African nations that still criminalise, not Australia or England or Canada. So who does the talking is important and what is talked about. So we're not going to get agreement on marriage equality, but maybe we can get agreement that children shouldn't be bullied at school because of their sexual orientation or the sexual orientation of their parents. So trying to find just little steps that we can take towards progress and just keep the dialogue happening.
Monash University law professor Paula Gerber, editor of the series Worldwide Perspectives on Lesbians, Gays and Bisexuals. Some countries still maintain the death penalty for same-sex acts. Associate Professor May Sato is based at Monash University Law School. She's just published a report focusing on state-sanctioned killing of sexual minorities.
55 countries retain the death penalty, and out of those, death penalty may be applied for same-sex intimacy in 11.
And how many countries actively execute people for same-sex acts?
2 countries, Iran and Saudi Arabia, actively execute persons convicted of having engaged in same-sex sexual acts.
And do we have any sense of the numbers of people that die?
Between 2015 and 2020, Iran hanged at least 6 men for penetrative anal intercourse with men, and in the same period, Saudi Arabia beheaded at least 5 men. But one thing to add is these are the cases that we have managed to identify, and we believe this is just the tip of the iceberg. The media reports that come out, it's often a curated version of events that the states are willing to disclose.
Just last month, a 20-year-old Iranian man, Ali Fazeli Monfared, was murdered by his family. It wasn't a state-sanctioned execution, but it was, if you like, a tolerated killing.
Yes, I believe he had applied for an exemption from compulsory military service by disclosing his sexual orientation, because under Iranian law, if you are a homosexual or transsexual or transgender, this is considered to constitute a medical psychological condition that warrants an exemption from compulsory military service. But what that means is that because if you come out as gay in Iran, because same-sex sexual act is criminalized, therefore family members or the community may engage in honor killing by arguing that the fact that Ali came out as gay was a dishonor to his family or to the community. And Iran distinguishes between murder and honor killing. So in certain situations, the offender may be exempt from punishment or may only need to pay a fine.
So this young man was murdered by his own family, and so have the killers been arrested or charged?
It's likely that they may be arrested or charged, but in this situation, for example, if the father forgives the perpetrators, then they may not be liable to criminal liabilities, or they may only need to pay a fine. And in Iranian law, if they could argue that the victim was engaged in a capital offense, so in this case, if the perpetrators argue that Ali was engaged in same-sex sexual act, then they will not be punished, or will only need to pay DVAT, the compensation or blood money.
The criminalisation of same-sex acts not only is a problem in itself, it also opens the door to violence against LGBTQI people.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also opens the door to other more subtle forms of violence, for example, conversion therapy, which is state-sponsored and strongly encouraged. And the problem with this is that in Iran, gay men, rather than trans persons, are strongly encouraged, or in some cases coerced, into undergoing state-sponsored sex reassignment surgeries. And in our report, we've identified at least 3 people who've died from such state-sponsored sex reassignment surgeries because they were carried out in conditions falling far short of medical and ethical standards.
We're talking about laws at a government level. I'm assuming also there's extrajudicial killings of sexual minorities by, say, police or military groups or groups close to powerful elites?
Yeah, absolutely. There's various types of state-sanctioned killings, and one we've identified is extrajudicial killing by state actors or by insurgent groups exercising governance control. And one example, more recent example, is what was happening in Chechnya Republic, the gay purge, where the authorities tortured, detained, and many of them have disappeared. But also in these circumstances, state actors, when they released the men, they told the family members that they could engage in honour killings and they would not be prosecuted.
And the Chechnya Republic is an autonomous part of Russia, although there's a lot of autonomy there. It's still part of Russia, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And the key point here is that Russia does not criminalise same-sex sexual acts. Killing of sexual minorities or people who are alleged are also subject to killings, even in countries where same-sex sexual act isn't criminalised.
As the co-author of this new report, what do you want people to think about and to change?
I think when we think about the death penalty, we often don't research or think about same-sex sexual acts as capital offence, because we only, in our research, showed 2 countries carrying out executions. But I think it's important to bear in mind that the killing comes in different forms, direct and indirect, and that the states are still involved in the killing of these persons.
Monash University Associate Professor Mai Sato, co-author of a new report, State-Sanctioned Killings of Sexual Minorities, and Director of the Elios Justice Initiative. Thank you for speaking to The Law Report.
Thank you.
That's the show for this week. A big thanks to producer Anita Barrow and sound engineer Melissa May. Don't forget, The Law Report is available from all your favourite podcast platforms. And at those platforms, please do leave a review. It helps others find the program. I'm Damien Carrick. Talk to you next time with more law.
You've been listening to an ABC podcast. Discover more great ABC podcasts, live radio and exclusives on the ABC Listen app.